Hi, I'd like to do a review of the Schwalbe Big Apple. You can see on this. This is a brand new one which I've just fitted to this bike, which is my down cadenza folding bike, which is my main sort of exercise fun bike for riding roads and off-road. Basically it's a go anywhere bike. These tyres allow me to roll very, very quickly on the road and also perform beautifully cornering, going off-road, gravelling, and I tend to ride dry tracks and the like. I don't ride during the winter or when it's extremely muddy, mainly because I don't particularly like cleaning the bike or the time it takes to clean the bike. The tyre that you see there, as I said, is a brand new one. The original tyre it came with is this one here, and this is the front tyre, the original front tyre. It's identical. It's a 559/50, which is a 2-inch 26 wheel, and the tread pattern is identical. There is a kind of lip here, which is one of the sort of points at which it's been released from the mould, which you can see. You can just make it out on this. It's not quite so clear, but the interesting thing about this has done about 3,600 miles, or 5,700 roughly kilometres if you're into kilometres as opposed to miles. The tread depth on this is about 0.8 of a millimetre. The tread depth on this is, at the centre, is about 0.6, so it's worn about 0.2 millimetres in 3,600 miles, which is pretty good going. It's deeper at the centre than it is at the side, which is, I think it's about 0.65 right down back here on both of those. So the wear that I've had on the front tyre is pretty minimal. I usually run these about 3 bar or 3.5 bar. The harder you have it pumped up, the more jarred the performance. And as you can see with this particular bike, there's no suspension on it. The suspension itself comes from the tyre. Being aluminium forks, it does seem to vibrate quite a lot, and where I've gone over rough ground it can be so bad it does actually hurt my hands, wrists. So it does mean that I tend to sit back further in the seat so I can unweight my hands on the handlebars, and so I'm just pushing the handlebars as opposed to resting on them. But anyway, let's take a look at the back tyre. The back tyre is a little bit more squared off, but still, after 3,600 miles or 5,700 kilometres, it's still in pretty good nick. You can see all the tread, albeit this is a lot shallower now, and can't remember how deep it is, but it's slightly squared off, although I don't know if it actually shows in the video because it's quite subtle, because even though I pump these up to 4.5, between 4 and 4.5 bar, as opposed to 3 and 3.5 bar for the front, which works to, I think it's about 60 psi for the back and about 40 psi for the front. So anyway, the reason why I've put a new set onto this bike as opposed to leaving the old set on was because I wanted to fit these onto another bike I have, which is a mountain bike which I've recently got, and I found that the tyre that it has is quite slow. So these have inverted tread, and I don't know if I pointed out that the new ones have a stripe that goes around, which is reflective, which I think is a really nice thing. The old ones didn't have that reflective strip. The writing itself isn't reflective either. The sidewalls on this feel quite thin, but having said that, I've ridden probably about 600 miles, roughly 1,000 kilometres off really quite rough road, gravel tracks and also flint tracks. I've never got a puncture on these. This is the tyre that these will be replacing, and one of the things that you can say about the tread is there's an awful lot more tread on this that actually meets the ground, especially when you're riding on road, than, say, for instance, on this. One of the things that is true is fresh air offers no grip. So the spaces in between here don't add anything to the performance of the tyre. And because it's a combination of the pressure and the surface contact area, the deformation that you have on this sort of tyre, even though it's kind of wider because of the knobbly bits, mean that it's slower because it's deforming the tyre more than these. So you can get away with these sort of wide tyres. There's about 2-inch wide tyres, and this is about the same really, except the knobbly bits make it look even wider. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't really used this in a sort of mountain bike type way. Whilst I have used this particular bike cross country, as I say, I use it as a go anywhere bike, and I've ridden the Ridgeway several times, Barbary Castle, White Horse and so forth, which is relatively rough track, and you wouldn't generally tackle that on a bike which wasn't capable of riding in fairly soft or rough ground. These tyres perform beautifully. I've got no complaints at all on the way these have performed. There's been times where I've ridden over rocks and the rocks have pinged out from underneath in such a way you can feel the bike move as it falls off this stone, and you think that's a guaranteed puncture, and it hasn't. It just hasn't punctured. And if you were, and I have checked, if you were to look closely at these, there's no divots, there's no cuts, there's nothing to indicate that these have been cycled on anything but the nicest of tarmac roads, which quite definitely they haven't been. I've taken them on some really, really rough tarmac roads. These are much lower pressure than, say, for instance, a road tyre would be, a much smaller road tyre. They're still fairly high pressured when compared to, say, for instance, a mountain bike tyre. If I know I'm going off-road for a long time, then I usually will drop these slightly, because it's just more comfortable, and as I said, that the punishment that you have to your wrists is just something else when these are pumped up hard. The rear seems to be okay. The legs seem to absorb a lot of the vibration from the back. A lot of the people that have these tend to run them at a lot lower pressure, but I just like the fact that it's fast, and I can cycle quite quickly on it. So these I'm quite comfortable at cycling about 19-20 miles an hour. They can hold it, and if the wind's behind me I can do 25 quite happily because of the gearing on this particular bike, which is an 8-speed. So it does mean that I pedal out at about 31, 32. My feet are going around so fast at that point that I can't really pedal anymore. So yeah, I hope that kind of describes the Big Apple Schwalbe. It's a fantastic tyre. It corners beautifully. It goes off-road, I think, fantastically, although the reviews I've read, people say that it's, it's not particularly good off-road tyre. I'm not an off-roader. I'm not someone who regularly rides a mountain bike in a kind of sort of competitive manner, so I don't really know, but for what I've done, I think it's fantastic. It hasn't let me down on any situation. Having it at fairly high pressure on loose ground, you can feel a slight side to side that you sometimes get when you're going over, say for instance, stones, and they're sort of falling either side, and your tyre's sinking in, but as it sinks in, it goes to one side, or it goes, and you get that sort of general movement. But for some people, I suppose it could be considered disconcerting, but to me it's fine, because it doesn't affect the cycling or the balance at all. It's just something that you feel, and you really can feel everything when you've got it pumped up. And the Kevlar guard, which you get with this, gives me the confidence that I can cycle. So this is the Schwalbe information saying it's got Kevlar guard. that's this particular thing. Say a 50, that's 50 millimeters, and 559 is the actual bead. So it's this bead, and the 26 is the outside diameter, and the 2-inch really is the 50 that it's talking about in that. So yeah, these go a lot wider, but because I'm running mudguards on this, oh, that's another thing. The mudguards that I have almost just as wide as the tyre itself, because the tyre is slick and it's just a sort of nice curve. You don't need the mudguards wider than the tyre. In fact, you can probably have them narrower than the tyre quite considerably, because the water tends to track up and bend, and sort of, so it's thrown up at an angle, and this side it's thrown up at that angle, and they kind of like meet. And depending on how fast you go, depends on really how high up it gets thrown before it sort of meets. If you have the mudguards fairly close, like so, then yeah, you don't have a problem. And similarly so if they're much narrower. But where you have, say for instance, a knobbly tyre, like this, the water tracks up into, say for instance, one of these knobbly bits, and it can't go anywhere, so it gets flicked up at this point. And with this sort of tyre, you must have mudguards minimum the width of the actual tyre itself, otherwise it will flick past it, whilst this won't. So, you know, all in all, I really like these tyres, and I thoroughly recommend them.